Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunattu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. So the topic before us is Swami Vivekananda's place in American history. So we are celebrating Swami Vivekananda's birthday, puja celebration on 17th and 18th of this month. There will be public celebration on 18th and morning puja on 17th. Now, in this context, it will be very interesting to go back to Swamiji's times. I mean, what was America like, American society, religious tradition, the religious landscape of America when Vivekananda came here? It's something very interesting. And it will be a great, very rewarding work for an historian to compare the evolution of America as a unique nation state, a unique socio-economic political experiment. A country that has opened its doors and windows to everyone from anywhere in the world, with all of some of the inherent limitations, but there is a gradual and steadily evolving concept of a kind of universal egalitarianism. It was not seen anywhere in the history of human civilization. People from any part of the world coming and finding hope and expectation and survival as symbolized by the Statue of Liberty. Now, and what is Vivekananda's place? So see the contrast. America is a new nation. So you find frequently many historians are of the view that nations and civilizations, like individuals, also go through different stages of infancy, boyhood or girlhood, youth, adolescence, old age. It happens to civilizations and also nations. So, now Vivekananda was coming from an ancient civilization, which has become so old. And Swamiji himself refers to that. I am proud to tell you that we have gathered in our bosom the purest remnant of Israelites, who came to southern India and took refuge with us in the very year in which their holy land was shattered to pieces by Roman tyranny. Swamiji is talking about either the destruction of Jerusalem temple or the collapse of Masada in 71 or 70 AD. And again, Swamiji indirectly refers to the destruction of holy places in the Middle East by Assyrians and Romans and many others, and how the Parsis, Jews, Christians, all of them came either as asylum seekers or as pilgrims to India and found refuge here. It's all happened in ancient times. It's a very ancient country, very ancient nation. So that was the country Swamiji was coming from. But on the social side, India was totally different as you can possibly imagine from America. So very often, it has been stated that Indian traffic that you see in the Indian roads in a way characterizes Indian culture. You may have, I don't know how many of you have gone to India. Those who have got an idea how the traffic works in India. You can drive anywhere or nowhere. And you are a law unto yourself. So this American spirit of independence and freedom you can find on Indian roads more than anywhere else. So that is one thing. But that is only one part of it. Behind and underneath all this, you find there is an ancient, continuing, endless flow of spirituality, spiritual culture. Swamiji draws our attention to this. So Swamiji, in one of his writings, draws our attention to something very interesting. An ordinary rickshaw puller. Rickshaw is a very primitive very primitive way. A rickshaw puller walking the streets, a humble man. He has high hopes. He's not depressed, at least during Vivekananda's times. He may be poor, he may be illiterate, he may not be living in palatial homes, but he has hope. He thinks that there is something much better to come. Not in this life, next life. So he's not going to die once for all when he dies in a hospital. He doesn't believe that he will die when his body disappears, gets destroyed. Something remains that doesn't die. So that hope, if you go to some of these holy cities like Benares, you find. Uppervalam, somebody living above the sky. He will see to everything. So he will give me a better life after this miserable, poor life in this lifetime. Now, that is something very interesting. So there is something that remains even when the body is destroyed. There is something transcendental that is a source of joy and bliss. Now, in America, what Vivekananda found was something different. Affluence, the genius of organization, efficiency, technology, science and technology, all these human skills. America was still slowly emerging. This was before the First World War. 15 years, 16 years before the First World War started, Swamiji was traveling in this country. So it was, in America was somewhat isolationist in many ways. It had no interest in European theaters of conflicts and political turmoil. So it was in a happy, blissful world. Science and technology, all is being experimented. But Swamiji found something else. There is underneath, there is a feeling of disappointment, a few tears, a few drops of tears behind every apparent laughter. Behind every apparent, how are you, wonderful, fine. Behind that there is a bit of depression, grief. That also Vivekananda found. It is not today, mind you. Today the whole world has become one, mind you. During Vivekananda's times, he found this. So we have to keep this in mind when we talk about Vivekananda's place in American history. The social freedom, the egalitarianism, the go-ahead spirits, and then the opportunities for everyone, equality, innovation. If you have got a new idea, the whole world will encourage you and clap their hands. They will not discourage you. They will support you. So that go-ahead spirit, the freedom, innovation, and the eternal spirit of adventure into external nature, that characterized America when Vivekananda came here. And he was a great admirer of the spirit of freedom, the spirit of inquiry, and the spirit of equality. And Vivekananda was wonderfully impressed by that. But he was also fully aware of an inherent problem. That is, this world is the only world to live in. This world of 5 elements, what science and technology can give you, that's the only thing that we have to think of. So that was a problem that that also Swamiji reminded us. So you can see this unique history right from 1620 when the first Plymouth colony was established, and then we have the history of the great American founders of the nation, Washington, Adams, and the great men like great saintly leaders like Lincoln, all these we have got in American history. But what prepared the ground for a monk from India to come and preach the message of spiritual egalitarianism, spiritual freedom? That ground, that preparation was made by the Transcendentalists. There are many others whose you can name, who may have made a contribution to preparing the ground for Vivekananda's advent, or that enabled America to appreciate a man like Vivekananda. So I have used this word appreciate. It's a very important word. You have to understand the history of Indology to fully appreciate, fully understand the significance of this. Interest in science of language, Sanskrit language, Indology, Vedas, all these started in Europe right at the beginning of 18th century. Mostly in Germany, then in France, in England, and many of these countries, later Italy, all these European nations made great contribution to Indology, the study of Sanskrit, recognition of Sanskrit as a unique language system, not a language, but language system. If you have anything to know about it, Monia Williams' English, Sanskrit English dictionary with a long introduction. It's a magnificent introduction to the whole science of philology and linguistics, where he speaks about Sanskrit language. But Europe responded to Vedanta only at the intellectual level. Europe produced a Max Muller, Keith, Winternitz, Colebrook, and many others even today. European scholars wrote dictionaries, interpreted the Vedas, MacDonald Vedic Reader, the first attempt in English language to give a philosophical analysis of some of the suktas of Rigveda Samhita. But it was America that responded to Vedanta and Indian culture at the emotional level. So, in fact, what struck me most about this aspect of America's response to Vedanta was when I read Thoreau's Walden. Thoreau was not a Sanskrit scholar, nor even Emerson, who wrote the well-known book The Brahma, which is a 4-couplets poem, which is actually in many ways a translation of some of the verses of the 2nd chapter of Gita. Though Emerson uses the word red slayer. The red is not used in Sanskrit, of course. So, if you read Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman and others, you find so much of Vedanta, but Vedanta understood and appreciated the emotional level, which you miss even when you read some of the most scholarly writings of European Indologists. See, when an American reads about something, he will grow a beard and go to Himalaya and spend a few months there. He will go to Ramana Maharshi's ashram and sit there looking at this strange man, half-naked person. But a European scholar will think of taking a PhD on linguistics and philology. That's certainly a great thing. It's a unique contribution. We cannot belittle their great contributions to contributions of great European savants like Max Muller, Colebrook, Winternitz, Monia Williams, and others. But it was America that responded to Vedanta and Eastern culture at the emotional level. And it was made possible because of Transcendentalism in this country. So it was Transcendentalist movement that actually made America the right place for Vivekananda to preach Vedanta. He speaks about freedom. He speaks about freedom at all levels, the physical level, political level, social level. He even criticizes the lack of social freedom in India, 19th century India, that he himself found at close quarters, traveling through the breadth and length of India, almost for 5 years he traveled all over India. So what struck him was the absence of social freedom, social taboos. So society shrunk, society didn't grow. But in America, what he found was social freedom at its best. So here there's an interesting statement in Vivekananda: freedom is the first condition of growth. If we go to India, there is perfect freedom at the spiritual level. You worship, or you are an agnostic, you are an atheist, you worship your God in whatever way you want. In your private home, or you build a temple. In the middle of the road, they build temples and places of worship, and they start worshiping. India is the only country where in public road, highways, you find tens of thousands of people praying on Fridays. You don't find that happening in even Middle East. But people don't criticize. Maybe it's a bit too much of freedom, you are not wrong if you say that. So, India got so much of freedom at the spiritual and at the religious level, and Europe had so little of freedom at the religious level. The slightest deviation or departure from the mainstream way of worship or liturgy can invite persecution, can lead to being burned at stake. It happened to so many. It happened to John, even the Czechoslovakian, the anglicized name, Johannes. It happened to many mystics all over Europe during the Middle Ages. If they proclaim, well, I can have a vision of Christ without the interference of the church, that is enough for them to deserve death by torture. But it never happened in India. So there's freedom at this level. But at the same time, there was no freedom even to cross the ocean. Crossing the ocean was considered to be a social taboo in India. So no freedom at the social level. So in Western countries, Swamiji found so much of freedom at the social level. But as a student of history, European history, he knew the history of crusades, Inquisition, and genocides, massacres, all that he knew. And also in contemporary America, Swamiji found so many religious movements in the 19th century. Different Christian and non-Christian or semi-Christian movements. Unitarian Association, Mormonism, Spiritualism in the 1840s, Theosophical Society, Faith Healing, Christian Science Movement, and different sometimes very strange forms of religious cults Swamiji came across in this country. And on the top of that, many intellectuals in America were influenced by what was happening in Europe at that time. Europe was going through a very interesting period in the middle of 19th century. Karl Marx came and Darwin came. So Marxism propounded the idea that religion is anti-humanistic, and Darwin said it is against the spirit of science. So the foundations of organized religious theology were shaking in Europe. At that time, Vivekananda came to this country. And he said, religion need not be against science. And religion is not against humanism. Religion is not an opium of the people. Why should it be opium? And opium actually makes you forget about things. It dilutes you. It creates an atmosphere of delusion. And it actually creates a make-believe world which is unreal, and you forget your own true nature. And there is a corruption of morality, your sense of morality, your sense of reality, your intellect, your reasoning power, all will be corrupted when you put your belief in some sort of a all-powerful anthropomorphic creator God sitting above the skies, who creates this world of it contains thousands of billions of galaxies, containing thousands of billions of stars. And that God suddenly, one day, all of a sudden, chooses to speak to one individual of one of the species of human beings, or just one of the species, in one of the tiniest things in the universe, that is the earth. And that almighty, omnipotent, all-knowing, all-compassionate God also creates a hell for you to burn and suffer. And also promises reward in the form of a wonderful place to stay, to live, if you just listen to him. Now, this was the idea that American intellectual elite were not willing to believe in when Vivekananda came. I think that was the influence of what was happening in Europe, the Unitarian movement, and also the contributions of modern humanists, and also modern scientists, neo-positivists. So why should you believe in a God who arbitrarily decides to create a divisive world and keeps humanity divided all the time, mutually conflicting? And that God is so all-powerful, and he can create this universe, and he decides to arbitrarily choose one man to whom he speaks, and he arbitrarily again appoints him as the sole representative and sends him to this world, either messenger or son, whoever may be called. So you find, if you read Vivekananda's lectures, you find many direct and indirect allusions and references to all these great ideas emerging or floating in the air, mostly in the east coast of America, and also among the intellectual circles of Europe. Now, Vivekananda presented a different idea of God and religion and life. God is not somebody who creates this world and sits away from the world he creates, who supervises with a big stick in his hands, with a list of do's and don'ts, with threats and promises of reward. No. God is one divine reality present in all of us. And to realize that God, you need not erect a temple or a church or a place of worship or rigidly follow one set of rules and regulations. You can follow as you have to go to kindergarten, you have to memorize the alphabet by writing in big letters, you have to repeat. But that's not the end of religion. So the idea that religion in its highest and most sublime sense goes beyond religion as we understand in terms of a place of worship, certain rituals mechanically performed, and believe in this Hulk, mighty man with a big stick. No. Religion is the realization of the divine spark present in all of us. And once we realize that, you don't become excited and go about killing your neighbors or hating those who don't belong to your own religion. Rather, you feel great joy within, and you feel great compassion for others living around. Well, one unique aspect of Vivekananda's preaching style was something interesting. And that's what I'm coming to. He didn't say this was an exclusive privilege of Hinduism. He said in every religion, in all organized religions, if you go deep enough and if you're sincere enough, you can find sparks of the same idea in all traditions. So you can find statements like, if you become a Vedantin, you become a better Christian. Vedanta makes you a better Christian, Vedanta makes you a better Buddhist, Vedanta makes you a better Hindu. So Vedanta, which he preached as the highest fruit of Hindu spiritual evolution, is something which is universal, and so it based on the idea of universal spiritual humanism, and it is so scientific, so rational, that it makes every person go deep and deep and deeper and deeper into his own or her own tradition and discover the diamonds, the great spiritual truths underlying in his own or her own religious tradition, without giving up your own faith or your own tradition that you're born into. Now, this is something very unique. I think that's what endeared Vivekananda. made him so dear, made him such a great figure in 19th century, in the last decade of 19th century. He didn't ask anyone to convert his or her religion and become a Hindu or a Vedantin. No. You become a Vedantin, then you start going to your church more regularly. You read the Sermon on the Mount with greater devotion, and you discover the deeper significance of Sermon on the Mount if you are a Christian. Or you may decide, well, I need not go to church any longer. I can pray to God. Jesus present within me. That's true of all religious traditions. So this ability to self-discover of these universal truths in one's own tradition, that was the unique style of Vivekananda's preaching. Second, in uniqueness that actually impressed Americans was that he did not insist on religion as a prerequisite to be spiritual. Today we hear a lot about Buddhism, Buddha's great spiritual teachings. Buddha was an agnostic, but he's also one of the greatest spiritual persons the world has ever seen. The first great religious teacher who actually preached in so many words that you can be spiritual even without being religious was Vivekananda. In this country I'm talking about, in America. The first great spiritual teacher from whom the Western world listened to, heard this message that you can be spiritual by becoming a better human being, by a true human being, or becoming a true human being is the way of becoming spiritual. That message first came from Vivekananda. Of course, this was the message of Buddha. This was, in a way, if you go deep enough, you find this message can be found in all traditions. And that universalism, it is called Universal Vedanta. Universal Vedanta actually means every religious tradition, when you go to the highest level of its experience, it is Vedanta. So he says you go through different stages in the spiritual evolution. You begin with rituals, as you begin with kindergarten, your education. Then you go through belief, theological ideas, philosophical ideas, speculations, parables, metaphysics. And then when you reach the experience level, then you reach the same point. Swami Vivekananda doesn't use this analogy, but you can find this analogy in some of the ancient scriptures. See, Buddha actually quotes this from a pre-Buddhist Hindu text. It is the story of pilgrims going at the top of a hill. There's a temple at the top of a hill, and pilgrims are walking up to the top of the hill where there's a temple. Each pilgrim thinks that he's the only traveler, he's the only pilgrim. But when he reached the top of the hill, then he found there were so many trails and roads that were leading to the same place, same destination, the top of the hill. But you won't understand this before he reaches the top of the hill. The top of the hill represents experience. Beliefs, rituals, mythologies, all these correspond to the lower levels, not wrong, but lower levels. I don't say lower, I would say earlier levels of evolution. Kindergarten comes before primary school comes before university, like that. So this universalism of spirituality, the idea that you can be spiritual without being religious, you can be spiritual by becoming a good human being. Rather, becoming a good human being is the essence of spirituality. These ideas the Western world heard for the first time from Vivekananda. I won't be doing full justice to this subject if I do not refer to some of the factors that influenced Vivekananda's evolution of spiritual thought, religious thought during his early years in India. Now, Swamiji was born in a religious family, and he spent nearly 5 years under Sri Ramakrishna, his guru, and learned and practiced all the great spiritual disciplines. He had a very good education, modern education to be specific. Plus, of course, his own traditional education. He knew Sanskrit. He learned many of the scriptures when he was quite young. And also he traveled all over India as a wandering monk. He was not an armchair philosopher. He traveled all over India. He lived in palaces with kings, and also he lived in open streets, sharing open streets with beggars. So he was a very unique person in that respect. But not only that, during his formative years, he had come across different social reformers in India who were actually highly influenced by many of the ideas of philanthropy, humanism, that were very popular in Europe at that time. See, Brahma Samaj, for example. Brahma Samaj was, in a way, in many respects, it was a blending of Unitarianism and traditional Hinduism. Because it did not believe in image worship, it did not believe in going to temples, it rejected non-dualism, but it accepted some of the teachings of modern Unitarian Church. Then he was also familiar with the Theosophical movement, and he was also familiar with the very conservative Orthodox Hindu reform movement. It's called Arya Samaj. And he had close interactions with Western scholars, these social reformers, conservative Sanskritists, and also ultra-modern agnostics of his time. He was himself a student in a Scottish Church College and later in Presidency College. Had a very modern education, and he had studied about French Revolution, he had studied about modern scientific developments happening in Europe at that time. So you find a unique blending of different ideas converging in Vivekananda's mind. So you find Swamiji was very rational. He realized that religion, to be acceptable in modern times, should present itself as a spiritual, transcendental idea which is humanistic but universal, which is not opposed to the spirit of science, the temperament of science and technology. So when Americans listened to such a presentation of a new spiritual idea, it was really a revelation to them. Now, it was America that had the privilege and the good fortune to welcome this idea, not Europe. If you read Vivekananda's lectures, he had some expectations that European countries, especially England, will be on the forefront in appreciating his ideas. He actually, maybe it's going to happen in future, we don't know. But anyway, Swamiji was not as highly appreciated in Europe as he was appreciated in America. He had many wonderful European devotees, but the emotional response to Swami Vivekananda's ideas could happen only in a country which had taken the trouble to travel 3,000 miles of Atlantic just to get away from the European conservatism, the rigidity, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and the tradition of burning and stake and genocides and massacres. So they wanted to escape from Europe and cross the Atlantic, came here as pilgrims, and only such a nation will have that open spirit and the courage to accept something totally new, something that comes from a totally alien tradition. So that's why Vivekananda's emergence, his appearance in America, in many ways represents a turning point in the history of religious thought in this country. Frequently it is not recognized Swamiji's influence is very much found and expressed in the writings and lectures of many scholars today, but unfortunately many of them do not openly recognize that. Now if you just show your appreciation for a great man's teaching without mentioning that person, if I quote Sermon on the Mount and I give you my opinion, it will be floating in the air. People take everything from Buddhism, but they don't mention Buddha's name. So there is a great danger in that tendency to disown, to deny the roots. As you know, if a branch of a tree says, "I'm independent," it makes no sense. If you remove the roots, then the branch cannot survive. The fruits cannot survive. The leaves cannot survive. Like that, when we express many of these great ideas that Vivekananda again and again repeated, can be found in all religious traditions. It's not that you have to go to Hinduism or Vedanta and learn from there. Go to your own tradition. Swamiji says again and again. Even Swami Tattwamayananda in his lectures in the early part of his years in Old Temple, in his lectures, he insisted again and again. If you go deeper into Christianity, you find the great universal ideas of Vedanta. Only when you understand Vedanta, then read the Sermon on the Mount, then you can see the profoundness, the depth and the universality of it. That is true of many other traditions also. But main problem that we are facing today, in today's intellectual trend, is you take everything from a great man and you make it yours, and very simple, in American jargon, you put it in a very attractive manner. It's a treason. Intellectually, it's a treason. If I can quote the great parables of Jesus, and without acknowledging it comes from Jesus, it's like dry leaves floating in the air. It can go anywhere it wants. So it's very, very important, because these great masters, whether Jesus Christ or Buddha or Vivekananda or any of them, or Confucius, any of these great masters. So Vivekananda's greatness was, while proclaiming the great wisdom of the Vedic sages, he always said, it comes from them. And the classic statement is unrivaled. He says, I have preached, I have talked, I have lectured, I have written. But if there was something worthwhile, it's all by the grace of my master. These are not his words, it is the idea that he expressed. Swamiji never claimed copyright of his own ideas. He said, if there was something great, something worthwhile in what he preached, it's all by the grace of Sri Ramakrishna. If there was something that is deficient, there is a problem, it is my burden, it is my problem. That humility is what actually preserves a great civilization. So in Vivekananda you find the acknowledgement of continuity and antiquity, both. Continuity, modernity and antiquity. So these ideas that he preached here came from the Vedic literature. That's why I preach nothing but the Upanishads. Swamiji insisted again and again. The idea of religious universalism, spiritual universalism, was proclaimed for the first time in recorded history in that statement that you find in the Old Temple in the Filbert Street. Indramitram varunam aktirahu ado divyasa suparno gurutman ekam sadvipra bagudha vadandi aktim yamam matarishwanamahu. The third and fourth line you find inscribed in our Old Temple inscription. That the first recorded statements come from Veda Samhita, and Swamiji repeats this again and again. So, in fact, in Chicago address itself, he repeats this. That's a very interesting statement you find in the early part. He says, whosoever comes to me through whatsoever form I reach him. All men and women are struggling through paths which in the end reach me. Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism have long possessed this beautiful earth, and so on. So, Ye dhamam prapadyante tam sadaiva bhajameham mama varma anuvartante manushyaha partha sarvasya. From the Gita. So, with all these great ideas that we are inspired by, even reading today, after more than 140 years, 130 years, it's continued to inspire people all over the world today. These ideas he never claimed as his own. He said all these ideas from the ancient masters. But they are modern, they are relevant to our own times. So, I want to conclude by making a few more important statements. And a very, very relevant statement, that's what I'm going to mention now. Now, today we are talking about, we are hearing and reading a lot about interfaith harmony, interspirituality, interfaith dialogue, interreligious dialogue. I have myself participated, my first interfaith dialogue it was conducted by the WCC, the World Council of Churches in India, that is 1993 or so. Now, what I mean to say, the idea that my religion and your religion are equally valid paths leading to the same goal, that idea for the first time came from Vivekananda. In modern times I'm talking about. And it was brought to this country and was appreciated in this country for the first time in Western world in 1893. But the idea is so ancient, and Vivekananda said, this idea need not be considered to be a unique feature of Hinduism or Vedanta. You find this idea, if you go deep enough, in all religious traditions, when you reach the experience level of every religious teachings, you reach there, you realize it, you understand it. But in modern times, it is Vivekananda who for the first time proclaimed this idea on a common platform, which is shared by all religious representatives of his times. That is, your religion and my religion are equally valid paths leading to the same goal. Only if you travel enough, if you are sincere enough, if you are truthful to ourselves enough, if you are planning to reach the top of the hill and don't stop midway, then we will understand that at the back of all and behind and beyond all external differences and diversities, there is one supreme spiritual ideal. And that ideal was realized and practiced by many mystics, many sages, and many saints, and great men and women in all traditions, and also those who did not belong to any tradition. Because spirituality is totally independent of the clutches of religion. Religion provides the discipline part of it. Religion helps you to follow certain disciplines, but once you reach the goal, that goal actually transcends the discipline. So the highest spiritual experience is spirituality, and once we realize this, we look upon the whole humanity as one spiritual family. If you read the Way of a Pilgrim, it's a 19th century Russian mystical work. A rustic Russian peasant who barely knew how to read and write, he happened to listen to a sermon on the first epistle of St. Paul, and he wanted to know the meaning of Jesus' prayer, and eventually he comes across a monk, and the monk takes him to his cell in the monastery and teaches him Jesus' prayer. And when the peasant learns this, immediately he felt great joy within, and he felt great sympathy and compassion and love for the whole creation. You can find the R.M. French translations. You find many such expressions in the Mahabharata, Bhagavata, many other scriptures, which shows that at the experience level, true religion, true spirituality makes us better human beings. It makes us universal, full of compassion and understanding for the whole creation, not only for fellow human beings. And this idea is at the root of the very concept of religious dialogue. So the idea that your path is, your way of looking at the truth, interpreting the truth or explaining the truth may be different, but truth is the same. That's at the root of interfaith dialogue. And the exclusivism and the fanaticism, all these are characteristics of those who are still evolving but not reached the core. So in many ways, I think in modern times, the first interfaith dialogue really took place in 1893 in Chicago. And it was on that platform that Vivekananda preached this great message. As I mentioned earlier, America was ready for it because America had produced these great religious, spiritual mystics. They are mystics in their own, in the American tradition. They are mystics like Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, and many others. The Christian Science movement and Theosophical movement, all these contributed and made the setting ready to listen to somebody like Vivekananda. So that's why his place is so unique in the history of religious thought. Of course, I will conclude by making a few more statements. After Vivekananda, you find within about 18 years, 13, 14, 15 years, the First World War started, which completely overturned the course of history of civilization, history of Western world, and then Depression, then the Second World War, and then all the other events that came one after another, which may have somehow overshadowed the great work that was done in 19th century, beginning with Emerson. But perhaps, discussion of this subject, exchange of ideas on this subject, and also an attempt to go back to the teachings of Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman can bring in a new era of spirituality in this great nation. Perhaps what we can do is to read again and to understand again Vivekananda's contribution. Vivekananda was not an Indian in that sense. He was as American as he was an Indian. He was a global person. He repeats again and again, he was a universal person. He didn't belong to any particular nation or even a particular religion or particular tradition. He was so universal. So, and thank you for listening to this lecture. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Order.